Lesson 2. Nothing is real. My depressive psyche continued to develop that winter, and by late February, I was fed up with the constant feeling of despair. I wasn't going to just drink my weekend away again at a random party with people I felt socially awkward around. Regardless of how the experience might go, I knew that a DSL connection would spice things up in my brain chemistry. I didn't care that it was a cold, cloudy winter day. I was certain DSL would add a joyful sheen to the environment. Coincidentally, one of my recent acquaintances, Jerry, had just acquired some solid DSL. He was a relatively short redhead, a classically Irish-looking fellow in most ways, though he had shoulder-length wavy hair like me, and somehow came across as a John Lennon type. I knew him from campus, and had watched him play guitar and sing with his band a few times. They weren't bad at all, but definitely young. About 2.5 years after this time, Jerry's music and band improved wonderfully, however much they were in the Bob Dylan/Beatles knockoff realm at that point. Anyway, Jerry was a cool cat with a strong taste for the Stones and just about any other classic rock and roll band. The extent of our relationship had been a few casual conversations at music events and a couple dorm room hangs getting stoked on green power. Though that was going well for the early stages of our friendship, it was certainly insufficient for a proper excursion into the great unknown together. At the time, though, I figured I could easily get along with him, and maybe if we shared a relatively strong power trip, it would solidify us as classic pals. Then there was Jerry's roommate, Ron. He was about the same height and build as Jerry, but was a pasty white kid with greasy black bangs, practically emo-looking, if not for the basic wardrobe and natural waviness to his hair. He did always wear black, though, and spoke in a sort of detached and quiet voice, like there were dark things about him he knew that he shouldn't share with anyone. I hadn't talked to him much prior to this day, and saw him as Jerry's roommate, who was simply not the same type of guy as us, and even worse, a green power mooch. So I didn't really want anything to do with him. For some reason, I didn't consider that he might very well be in my vicinity for some length of the DSL experience, if not the entire time, and I haphazardly accepted Jerry's DSL connection invitation. I walked on over to his dorm building on that grey, chilly hip forest afternoon. Once in their room, we started chatting as Jerry prepared a green power vessel. He commented that Ron wasn't going to connect to DSL with us because Ron had been feeling kind of down lately, and Jerry didn't think it was a good idea for Ron to mess with that. It was awkward to hear, mostly because Ron was in the room while Jerry talked about him as if he wasn't there, and also wouldn't be offended by the comment. I told him that I was fine with that, and that it sounded like it was probably a good idea. Set and setting are important, I chimed in, happy to flaunt my great unknown wisdom. I elaborated that he could be the one who sat for us and could effectively keep everything grounded in case we got too detached from reality. I thought it was a great idea. Ron gave me a sympathy chuckle, but didn't respond to my suggestion more than that. So it was settled, and we decided to get on with the DSL connection. Jerry explained that we should each connect to 2 chips, because one was probably going to be a bit underwhelming. I asked if he knew what their dose really was, and he said he was told each chip was a bit mellower than a standard one, whatever that meant. I took his word for it, and we each dropped 2. Jerry put on a Jimi Hendrix record, and decided it'd be fun if the 3 of us played the card game Asshole. The game of Asshole involves trying to get rid of all your cards in accordance with the rules. Whoever gets rid of their cards first is the president the next round, a position that allows the player to enforce a certain rule. Second place makes the vice president, a position with similar powers, and last is the asshole, the player who basically becomes the slave of the group. The asshole shuffles the deck and deals the cards while being constantly reminded of their asshole title. Of course it was just a normal card game, but the more times I got called an asshole as a consequence of the play of cards, the more I felt like I was mentally, and perhaps spiritually, losing. I didn't like the sadist powers of the president, and I became scared that this foreshadowed some dire circumstances. As I got more sketched about the card game's implications, I suggested we go outside before it got dark. Jerry and Ron put on snow pants, while I decided not to return to my room for extra gear. We were just going for a stroll, and didn't have much time before dusk. The destination was Centennial Woods once again, the forest that had been my great unknown hub all first semester. There was a busy main road we had to cross to get there, a 4-lane road with a grassy divider to separate opposing traffic. We ran across the street and paused on the grassy island for a moment to let the traffic pass by. As cars passed on both sides, we felt the whoosh of each and every one, as if we stood close to a passing subway train. "It feels like a roller coaster," I giggled with delight. This seemed like a nice enough intro to the effects of the great unknown. It was a controlled flirt with danger, the rush of machinery exhilarating from a safe proximity. We eventually made our way across and laughed as we realized that jaywalking probably wasn't the safest thing to do given the circumstances. "But luckily we have Ron here to watch after us," I said, half joking. His response was silence, as if crickets were chirping, and it was a weird thing to say. We kept on toward the forest, and Ron suddenly started to talk more, far more than he had the whole day. "Yup, we'll be safe until we meet the spirit bear. Once we meet the spirit bear, though, he will eat us all," Ron said slyly. We laughed at what had to have been a joke, obviously, but he assured us that he wasn't kidding. Jerry told him to cut it out, but Ron was sure that a real-life spirit bear lived in the woods and ate people who trekked into the great unknown in the wrong way. Unfortunately, his story allowed anxiety to creep in, despite my best efforts to laugh it all off. Although I was 20 years old and shouldn't have been afraid of spirit bears, I also was in the great unknown with a creepy fellow who wouldn't let up on his joke. We found a place to sit down in the snow while Ron sparked up a green power vessel, which he then passed to me and Jerry. Jerry marvelled at how pretty the trees looked, and I started to relax into the melting snow. Our journey seemed to be going for the better until Ron started to talk about PCP on our way back to the dorm room. "See, the thing about PCP is that it can make you go insane, but there is no detectable scent or taste," Ron said, as he gave me a wide-eyed David Blaine-type look. I got a strong sense of fear, like the feeling you'd get if you suddenly realized a shooter was in the grocery store. I had fucked up. I had accepted green power from someone I didn't know well, and also didn't watch him prepare it. But who'd actually lace green power with PCP? Then it occurred to me that there was no reason why he wouldn't be the person to do it. He somehow factored into conversation that he grew up near a nuclear power plant, so he was likely poisoned by radiation, like the rest of his community. Why did he share all those dark details with us then? And what did it all mean? Was PCP a way of psychically poisoning people, and possibly hijacking their consciousnesses? My mental situation became all the worse when we saw a police helicopter fly over and land on the outskirts of the forest. When we reached the forest's edge, we saw 2 college girls on the ground, one who catatonically rocked back and forth with her hands pressed on her head, and the other who cried and mumbled things while she looked around frantically. They were surrounded by 4 people dressed in army green uniforms that looked vaguely medical. I knew the best thing for us to do in this situation was to keep our gazes forward, away from the madness that we should certainly have nothing to do with. The helicopter turned on, and we turned around to see the 2 girls gone, ostensibly airlifted away for an unknown course of intervention. What do you think happened to them? I offered up, as I felt a little less worried about my own situation in relation to what we had witnessed. They clearly took too much PCP and went insane. You could see it in their eyes, Ron said, as he started cracking up. I didn't welcome the return of his PCP narrative. Dude, shut up. You have no way of knowing what was going on there. Stop trying to scare us, I said, more aggressively than intended. Jerry reinforced my position, and we continued back to the dorm, as we enjoyed our momentary confidence. Though I can't remember specifics, Ron managed to utter a few more cryptic things before we made it back to the dorm room, and I knew I had to directly ask him if he had laced the green power or not, because otherwise I would not be able to enjoy the experience. Unfortunately, he said nothing and only laughed as Jerry quickly tried to dismiss my notion, and again told Ron to knock it off. I don't know if my paranoia was contagious, but I watched Jerry become more withdrawn and less confident about his own grip on reality. So, my name is Jerry, and I'm a student at Hip Forest University, Jerry asked earnestly. Yeah, whatever that means, I offered back meagerly. The implications of our language use became painfully clear. Somehow, we both received the idea we were mental patients in a controlled hallucination or simulation, and it made sense because there was a prominent hospital on campus, the perfect front for the whole operation. Perhaps long, long ago, we had journeyed into the great unknown beyond sanity, and had required sedation to be placed in this simulation of going to college. In reality, this was all just mental gymnastics for the sake of untangling our psychoses, and unfortunately quite far from reality with a capital R. I suddenly recognized the feelings as familiar, and I took a study of Ron, who stood there quietly with a grin on his face as we relayed our paranoia. Oh fuck, I said, in defeat. I couldn't believe it had happened again. You're James, aren't you? Well, my friends call me Ron, but James isn't so bad either, Ron said with a chuckle, as he enjoyed his surprise position of power I had gifted him. I should have known, I groaned. You're everything like James. Who the fuck is James? Jerry said in a panic. I can't explain right now, dude, I replied with a sigh. We just have to do what Ron says now. We have no choice. He's in control now, unfortunately. I realized I had just voiced contempt for Ron's control over us, so I quickly changed my tune in an effort to seem more allegiant and possibly spare myself some torture. But Ron's the man. I'd do anything for Ron, I added in. Ron was visibly gratified by my self-correction, and my paranoia about getting fucked by the devil resurfaced. I pictured Ron, this new form James had transformed into, the guy who had stolen my soul 6 months earlier, seated on a throne with me on his lap, him sadistically satisfied with my eternal psychological torment. Jerry was still plenty confused, and now quite scared as he realized there was something he wasn't hip to that was, apparently, a rare form of ill fate. Ron told us we should go out in the hall, and with both of us convinced that something bad might happen if we didn't, we followed him out. Before we left the room, I looked out the window and saw people building a snow fort in the community green. Though their reality status was shaky to me, at least there appeared to be people still going about their Saturdays in a normal way. We exited their room into the hall and started to walk towards one of the ends. The normal rectangular prism of the hallway had trouble keeping its boundaries together, as I watched its edges and surfaces wave and shift in a contradictory manner. Eventually, this guy Martin appeared in the hall. He was an extremely skilled drummer, and had more or less moved on from Jerry's musical projects, but was a good friend of his, no doubt. I was pleased to see Martin, because he always possessed an even keel attitude, like many Zen drummers I have met in my day. To my misfortune, I wasn't convinced that this Martin was the Martin I once knew, as one of his eyes seemed to go completely sideways until he blinked it back in place. Man, Ron really thought me the fool, didn't he? To craft a cheap rendition of Martin with a lazy eye, and to think I wouldn't notice. Of course, whatever abilities Ron possessed in order to craft entire shams of beings must have been complicated. Surely he wasn't able to fill in all of the gaps. Would this become a test to see if I could handle his shenanigans until the DSL dislodged? As I talked to Martin, he seemed normal enough as he casually asked what we were up to. We shared a bit of small talk, as if nothing out of the ordinary was going on. Just a couple fellas on a DSL connection with their sitter. Ron instructed us to follow him because he decided that he wanted to show us something. Terrified of what we'd be shown, we followed him cautiously to the end of the hall. We stopped at the common room of the floor, which was closed with lights out and chairs stacked upon one another along the windows. I don't know why it was so hard to tell what the room actually looked like inside, but I remember thinking that it was impossibly filled with chairs stacked in terrible ways, something Ron had conjured up to torment us with. Ron told us that we had to unstack all of the chairs. "Do we have to?" Jerry said, like a kid being asked to put his toys away. We looked at each other hopelessly, as if to communicate, well, better buckle up and get used to this, because life is now being enslaved to Ron. Luckily, the door was locked when Ron went to open it, and he didn't have a key. We should have taken this as a sign that he didn't have all the power, but he played it off and chalked it down to our luck that he had misplaced the key. When we got back, it didn't take long for Martin to see something was up. He asked me what was wrong. "Ron's trying to make us gay," I said in despair. Ron laughed, while Jerry stayed stone-cold silent. "Oh boy, this isn't good," Martin replied. It wasn't that it was bad if we were gay, but because Martin knew it probably wasn't true, he reasoned it must have been a bad trip for us. Ron chuckled. "Come on, guys. I'm not trying to make you gay. Some girls are coming over soon," Ron said, having a blast with the commentary. It was a strange response, and all I heard was, "Don't worry, guys. The devil likes fucking girls too, of course. It will be a delicious fivesome." Ron must have texted those girls. I don't remember what happened, really. Maybe Jerry texted the girls to come over. Maybe I even suggested it. But sure enough, 2 girls shortly entered and took their seats. Jerry sat on his bed while I sat on Ron's bed, which were directly across from each other, as they are in dorm rooms, and it just so happened that the girls decided to sit across from each other on the opposite beds, as if we were being paired up, so I thought. It was all enough to fuel my perception that they were nothing but carbon bots created by Ron to appease us before he brutally fucked us all. The girl who sat with me was an Asian girl named Hannah, and the girl who sat with Jerry was a Jewish girl named Jenna. I thought they were both very attractive, and it made sense to me that Ron would give me an Asian partner to ease my tension because he had access to my head and knew my preferences. Likewise, it didn't seem unlikely that Jenna might be Jerry's dream girl. That's the only reason I bring up their ethnicities, not to exoticize, but to illustrate how much it seemed like Ron had access to our brains. We got on talking, with rather normal conversation from what I can remember, though somehow it eventually started to sound vulgar to me, like everything was an innuendo. With that frame of mind, I listened to Hannah say she really wanted to go get some food at the dining hall, and I thought she meant that she wanted to feast on me. I suggested I join her, and though she was a little confused why I was so adamant about joining her, she shrugged it off and seemed to figure, why not? We left the room and started to walk down the stairs when I asked her where her room was. She asked me why I wanted to know. "Well, that's where we're going, right?" I replied. It was weird how innocently confused I was about why we weren't going straight to her room to have sex. She looked at me puzzled and reaffirmed that she only wanted to go to the dining hall. Realizing I had read her all wrong, I apologized and explained what had happened in my head. She took it well and laughed as she offered that it was no big deal. So I decided to join her at the dining hall anyway. I wish I had more to say about the walk to the dining hall and the time we spent there as she ate dinner while I anxiously sipped soda and peered around, convinced that everyone around me was a fabrication of Ron's doing. Were they merely vapor trails, only non-physical illusions to surround me as a simulation of college folk? I do remember Hannah got less and less interested in me, probably due to me sufficiently weirding her out, especially having informed her that I had recently thought an evil demon figure was the one who had delivered her to me. Maybe she didn't care or think much of the whole thing, for all I knew. I'm not the one to ask about that. My memories of that time feel like autopilot. I was sure that I was interacting with only fake people who served as an extension of a puzzle Ron had captured me in. Everyone behaved like real people, but that's exactly what fake people would do. We decided to walk back to Jerry and Ron's room. I figured I should see how Jerry was doing, and half expected to find him a bloody decapitated mess. But there he was, still shooting the shit with Ron and Jenna. As we arrived, Jenna decided it was time for her to go, and Hannah followed suit. They pardoned with a polite, "Nice to meet y'all," as they exited, so it was back to the three of us. Ron said he had to visit someone's room to pick something up, and suggested that we follow. We walked with him up a couple flights of stairs, and I felt like something big was about to happen. We approached a room that had some decorations around the door frame, with a painting of Roman pillars and gold, writing above the door that read, "Church of Argonaut." So this was the truth, I thought. The real religion or centre of spirituality was some Greek god named Argonaut, and we were about to meet him. I was prepared for us to enter the door, and to never come back to anything that resembled reality again. As we approached the door, 3 guys with brown skin went towards the door from the other direction, and got there first. One of them had a black backpack on, and suddenly my mind went to ISIS, I'm ashamed to say. It was fear evoked from implicit bias, from having grown up in a tiny forested town of the north, surrounded by white people, and having been 8 when 9/11 happened. Perhaps the DSL connection had brought it to my attention, as if to say, look how scared you get when men who look Middle Eastern walk around with a black backpack. You should be ashamed. That being said, I actually thought of them as possible fellow power trippers who were on a mission of their own, and I probably would have been paranoid about any group I saw with a backpack for any other reason. Anyway, they exited the door after a few minutes, and I peeked inside to see a variety of dudes gathered around a desk. Ron walked in and left us outside. In hindsight, I'm pretty sure he was just picking up some green power, and later learned that the room belonged to a member of a local band called Argonaut and Wasp, hence the Church of Argonaut writing. What a coincidence, though, for all of this to be there, and to fit so well with the delusion that I was experiencing. But I guess that's how delusions work. Everything you perceive seems related to you, and it all becomes part of the conspiracy. Ron emerged minutes later, and we went back to his room. Though I never walked into the Church of Argonaut, and nothing particularly threatening had occurred, I was stuck on my belief that there was still an impending doom. Ron was merely taking his time with the torture to make it more nuanced and thus more satisfying. He started to set up his camera on a tripod, and I asked him what he was doing. "Oh, I just want to take an artistic photograph. I want it to look something like this," he said with blunted affect. He handed me his phone, which displayed an image of an abstract painting, mostly a sheet of red with a bit of black and white peeking out of the lower right-hand corner, or at least that's what I remember. "What is it?" I asked, more puzzled than worried. "I don't know, but it's called Death. I think the name suits it well, don't you?" He maintained his blunted speech. At that point, I was sure that Ron was planning to pull out a gun and film our execution. I started to panic, but kept my cool as he fiddled with his camera. Then I looked out the window. I couldn't believe what I saw. The people who were building a snow fort earlier had created a sizable igloo at least 4 feet high or so. But even more impressive was the large green neon light that beamed down on top of its center like the stereotypical beam from a UFO. I watched people move in and out of the igloo as if sacrifices were being brought to the beam. I couldn't tell you what really happened there, whether they had projected a green light somehow, or if I was so far gone in the great unknown that I saw something that wasn't there. That same colour green has magically appeared during other connections I've had, but I have no solid hypothesis for its meaning. All I knew was that shit was really going down, because now some sort of aliens were moving between worlds, and maybe all of those college kids were really aliens in disguise all along. In the panic, I decided it was better to die trying to escape than to die a sitting duck, so I rushed to the door and mumbled that I had to go back to my dorm because I had just remembered something. Jerry and Ron were visibly disappointed, but I ducked out of the room and headed straight for the stairs in a speed walk as if some nameless cronies were hot on my tail. But no one followed. I exited their dorm and entered into a full sprint back to mine. I'm sure I looked peculiar to the people who were walked the campus. I was running at full pace in non-athletic winter clothing. In my head I thought, this is what I've been training for my whole life, run like Sonic the Hedgehog. I made it back to my dorm through a torrent of visual swirls and encountered some girls from the floor below me. I quickly said hey with a nervous laugh and continued my pace back to my room. I opened the door to find Omar on the lower bunk and John on his computer facing the window. I grunted hey again and climbed into my top bunk, where I shivered from the cold just as much as from the shock of what I had just experienced. Omar and John asked what I had been up to, and in no time it became clear to them that I was deep in the great unknown. But they didn't seem as concerned as I would have liked. They were both quite steeped in the green power and bantered with each other in a way that seemed insensitive to my current plight, and even purposefully confusing perhaps. They probably just figured, hey, Steverino trips a lot, so this is probably just something he goes through sometimes. He'll be all right. It wasn't long, though, before I didn't trust their reality statuses and realised I still felt like I was stuck in Ron's astral grip. My current human interactions away from him were only with shallow, illusory projections of people from my past life, like Martin had been. Ron might have let me out of his sight, but now he was going to torture me with an even more elaborate illusion. The way Omar and John stonily chuckled and peered at me with red, green power eyes convinced me that they were of demonic origin. At one point, John reached a hand into his closet and looked around conspicuously as if he was paranoid about me noticing him. I was sure he was about to pull out a gun and shoot me as a means of doing Ron's dirty work, but he simply pulled out a sweatshirt for his own comfort. I became less afraid of them, but I knew I needed to leave the room because I fancied myself unable to find peace, cocooned in my covers on my top bunk, like a frightened cat who had scurried to higher ground. I racked my brain for people who could deliver me from this evil, who I knew I would be able to tell the reality status of. Then I remembered that Rasheed had told me he was going to this new place downtown called the Psychedelicatessen, where you could get food on a pay-what-you-can basis. Of course, it was Rasheed. That's who would get me out of this hole. He always knew how to stay grounded, how to keep it real. The walk from my dormitory to the Psychedelicatessen usually took about 25 minutes on a summer day, but the nighttime wintry journey I took upon myself became treacherous. The sidewalks were all but completely frozen, with sharp fragments of cracked ice. I remember flinching a couple times as I heard college kids yell and fool around on the streets around me. They were most likely in benign drunken jubilance, though were still possible enemies in my current state. Eventually I found the Psychedelicatessen, and instantly it seemed like a really bizarre thing to exist, even just from the outside. It was so easy to imagine that this was a fictional location, meant to act as a personal lure for me and my psychedelic obsession, something I thought was a guaranteed path of virtue. But for all I knew, it may have been a damning path in disguise. I opened the door to find Rasheed playing guitar in the corner while his girlfriend sat at the bar with food and drinks. There were no other customers there, but I saw Rasheed's old roommate bust dirty dishes into the kitchen and saw a guy who I can only describe as a hybrid between a balding, mustached, middle-aged circus ringleader and the wise monkey Rafiki from The Lion King. I later came to know him as Phil, the owner of the Psychedelicatessen, and a nice man determined to evoke positive psychedelic energy through his business. I said hi to Rasheed's girlfriend, who seemed normal and real enough, and looked around to see just about every psychedelic-concerned book I knew of at the time. There was a large Alex Gray art book, Food of the Gods, by Terence McKenna, and Be Here Now by Ram Dass, amongst others. I thought the place was really cool, and managed to calm down significantly, but was still a bit concerned about the mental conclusions that had resurfaced, namely, the one about actually being dead and trapped in a demon's artificial world. Eventually, Rasheed stopped playing guitar, and we sat at one of the high tables where his old college roommate also joined us. As we drank some chai tea, which, of course, they had, in my mind, because chai was my favourite tea, and this was my personalised psychic trap, I briefly explained to them what was going on in my head. Rasheed said that it sounded like I had gone into the great unknown with guys I just didn't know very well, one of which sounded really weird, aka Ron, and that he was probably just fucking with me, because it's a thing some people actually enjoy doing, unfortunately. People will just mess with tripping people out of enjoyment, I said in disbelief. It seemed like the ultimate evil to me that I never imagined anyone capable of, yet it made perfect sense. Still though, even if I didn't seem to be in any immediate danger, I continued to feel like nothing was real to me anymore. I can't even tell if you guys are real right now, like if you're the same versions that I knew before, I said sadly. Well, nothing is real, man, Rasheed said with a little chuckle. We established that one a long time ago. I knew what he was referring to. When we were kids, we were at a family lake house and had shared some argument. I don't remember what it was about, but eventually I had blurted out, "But nothing's real," to which he and my cousins laughed. "How can nothing be real?" he had said back then, but it seemed 10 or so years later that he knew exactly how nothing could be real. It in fact made perfect sense to him, or at least enough sense that he thought it was me who should know, if anyone. Turns out I didn't mean it the same way then that I did in this instance. I wasn't satisfied with his answer though, because it wasn't helpful to believe that things had always been fake, and that I just hadn't been aware of it. I laughed at what I thought must have been his joke of an answer. No, but really, Like I'm scared that none of you are really real, I reaffirmed. He could tell I was serious about it. But how did you know that anything was real before the trip? He replied in earnest. I mean, what is real to you is what you perceive in the present moment, and that's all your reality will ever be. What else would it be, if not this? He had a point, but it hadn't reached me so well just yet. But how can I ever know that you guys are the real you from before, and that there isn't something secretly wrong with this new reality? I replied with unrelenting paranoia. Even if everything was seemingly the same, who could say that it wasn't James at the end, ready to fuck me and steal my soul for good? I guess you can't ever really know, Rasheed admitted. I seemed to have stumped him for a second, but he was philosophically capable. But what difference would it make? None of us know what's going to happen when we die anyway. Even if it is an elaborate deception, what other choice do you have except to participate in the deceptive hallucination and enjoy it as much as possible? Rasheed reasoned well. Though this is an approximation of what he said, to this day it's ultimately how I come to peace with having experienced the delusion. That being said, I was too far gone at the time to register what he told me and to take it with conviction. I was too tired and bewildered from my trip to have serious metaphysical discussions and had 0 philosophy classes under my belt at the time. I returned to my fear that the only way to get out of this fake reality would be to have sex with Ron. I told them that I had a feeling I might have to experiment to get my old life back, just to see what they would say. Well, we know all about experimentation, don't we, Tim? Rasheed said to his roommate. Oh yeah, Tim replied with a grin. Experimentation is very important. I instantly worried that part of Ron's trap involved enduring some undesirable sexual experiences. I decided I'd rather die than be a part of whatever orgy may or may not take place. So I thanked them for talking me through my paranoia and said that I was finally fit to trek back to my dorm. There's not much to report about my walk back to my dorm room. Of course I was still jumpy. Even if there was a sense of coming down, I figured it was only temporary, a mere trick of Ron's. But I was tired of being on guard. If I really was in Ron's grasp, there was simply nothing I could do to prevent what was inevitable. So I figured I might as well at least act like everything was okay, and then if everything really was, then I was just back to doing my normal person thing. Omar and John seemed more or less back to normal when I got back to my dorm room, and the lights were out sooner than later. I couldn't sleep for at least a couple hours, still in shock that my devil delusion had returned in full force. Where had I gone wrong? Was I tricked into a paranoid delusion again, or had it actually been real the first time it had happened? Had I never returned back to normal reality in the first place, but had rather been on standby for James's next leg of the trick, his transformation into Ron? I fell asleep due to mental exhaustion rather than any sort of peace of mind. The next morning I got shitty breakfast at the dining hall, as I usually did, and resumed a normal day as I put back together the pieces of my sophomoric reality. That spring semester ended up being a rough time for me. I had ditched my psychology major in the fall, and though the anthropology classes I took were interesting, I could tell I still didn't know my future career path. So I ended my second year of college, not only unsure about the direction of my academic career, but also uncertain about whether my meddling with the great unknown and the green power had really been a net positive for me. Was this identity I had formed since high school founded on a delusion that these powers held some inherent virtue that wasn't really there? Was I really just messing with my precious brain chemistry and bound to lead myself to a more permanent psychosis if I wasn't careful? I decided to take a quote-unquote long break from all powers to get my act back together and maybe even recreate myself a bit. Surely there was an interesting, attractive part of myself without the influences of the great unknown? What was the worst that could happen if I saw how long I could abstain